All right, welcome back, everyone. This is an original story from Hidden Revenge Family, and it took a turn you truly didn't see coming. Let's get into it.
I stood behind the one-way glass in my Washington, D.C. office and watched my little sister walk in like she owned the building. Cassidy Vance had always known how to make an entrance. Beige designer suit, gold heels, hair perfectly styled like she was about to step onto a red carpet instead of into a federal contract negotiation. She didn't glance at the firm's name etched in brushed steel outside the conference room. She didn't need to. As far as she knew, Vance & Associates was just another high-powered law firm, lucky enough to represent her. She had no idea whose last name was on that wall. Inside the conference room, 2 Department of Defense procurement officers stood to greet her. My senior partner, Daniel Brooks, shook her hand with a polished smile. He played his role well. He always does. $5 million. That was the value of the contract sitting on the table. Cassidy was there to finalize a deal to supply what she branded as war therapy art installations for newly built military bases. According to her pitch deck, her artwork helped service members process trauma, reconnect with their humanity, and heal through visual truth. Visual truth. That phrase almost made me laugh. I crossed my arms and leaned slightly closer to the glass. From this side, I could see everything. From her side, she saw nothing but her own reflection. Cassidy placed a leather portfolio on the table and opened it with a slow, deliberate motion. She loved suspense, loved the performance of it. She spoke with confidence, hands moving smoothly as she described the emotional depth of her pieces. These works are based on first-hand emotional immersion, she said. I study battlefield psychology. I translate it into form. Battlefield psychology. I swallowed once steady and controlled. I learned years ago that visible reactions are a liability. Daniel nodded. We've reviewed the catalog. The authenticity is compelling. Compelling. That was one word for it. Cassidy turned the portfolio toward the officers. The centerpiece of the collection, she said, is titled The Last Breath. My stomach tightened before I even saw it. She slid the printed image forward. And there he was. A 19-year-old private from 1st Battalion, blood soaking through his uniform dust, still clinging to his jaw, his eyes half open, his mouth slightly parted. The exact angle of his collarbone fractured from the blast. I stopped breathing. Fallujah. 10 years ago, the day the sky turned white from the explosion, the day I pressed both hands into a chest cavity and tried to clamp an artery that wouldn't cooperate. The day I told a boy he was going to make it, even though I knew he wouldn't. I drew that image 3 hours later on the back of an emptied morphine supply box, while sitting on an overturned Humvee. I drew it from memory because I didn't want his face to disappear the way so many others had. And now it was labeled under Cassidy's name. The emotional tension in this piece, she continued smoothly, reflects the fragile line between life and loss. Fragile line. She had no idea how accurate that line was. She had no idea I had measured it in millimeters while kneeling in sand mixed with blood. One of the officers leaned forward. You've witnessed combat yourself. Cassidy smiled. Not too big. Just enough humility. I've spent years interviewing veterans and immersing myself in their lived experiences. Interviewing. Immersing. That was one way to describe stealing a duffel bag full of battlefield sketches from your sister. I felt the old heat in my chest, but it wasn't rage. Rage is loud. This was colder than that. This was precision. I watched her point to specific details in the image. The shading along the rib cage. The tension in the medic's gloved hands. My hands, though, she never mentioned the medic in the frame. In her version, the focus was always the suffering soldier, never the one trying to hold him together. Of course, she cropped me out. The anatomical realism is extraordinary, one officer said. Yes, it is, because it wasn't imagined. It was documented. Cassidy nodded modestly. I believe art should serve those who serve. That almost did make me laugh. Behind the glass, I rested my fingertips against the cool surface and studied every brushstroke in the reproduction. She had layered oil over graphite thick enough to alter the texture, but not enough to erase what was underneath. She never understood materials. She never understood that certain lines are too intentional to hide. My name wasn't visible on that print. Not in ink you could see under normal light. But it was there. 10 years ago, I learned something simple in combat medicine. If you don't label correctly, things get lost. Blood bags, surgical kits, bodies, so I labeled everything, including my art. Cassidy closed the portfolio and looked directly at Daniel. I'm excited to move forward. These installations will redefine therapeutic spaces across military facilities. Daniel gave the cue. We're prepared to finalize pending signature. The contract was slid across the table. $5 million, federal funding, criminal liability if fraud was involved. I stepped away from the glass and straightened my blazer. The irony of the firm name wasn't lost on me. Vance and Associates. Cassidy assumed the firm belonged to our father's extended network. A distant cousin, a legacy connection. She never checked corporate ownership filings. She never imagined I'd build something this big. She especially never imagined I'd build it quietly. Through the speaker feed in the observation room, I heard the scratch of her pen as she signed. Cassidy Vance. Bold, confident, wrong. I exhaled slowly. She thought this was her peak. A federal contract. National exposure. Permanent credibility. What she didn't know was that this firm belonged to me. What she didn't know was that every piece in that catalog had already been reviewed by my intellectual property team. What she didn't know was that beneath those layers of oil paint hidden in medical-grade luminescent ink were identification numbers, dates, and unit designations only one person could verify. Me. She adjusted her sleeve and leaned back in her chair, satisfied. From where I stood, I could see it clearly, the highest point of her career, and the exact moment gravity would start doing its job. She doesn't know who owns this law firm, and she definitely doesn't know what I hid inside those lines 10 years ago. Tell me something. Have you ever watched someone build a reputation on your work while everyone around you called them the genius? Have you ever stayed quiet long enough for the truth to mature instead of explode? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know. I kept my eyes on that sketch of the 19-year-old private, and just like that, I was back in the sand. 10 years earlier, I wasn't standing in a glass office in D.C. I was kneeling in Fallujah with blood running through my fingers. I enlisted at 18. Not because I had something to prove. Because I didn't want to be the fragile one in the family. That role was already taken. Cassidy was 2 years younger than me. Soft voice, soft hands. Always surrounded by sketchbooks and praise. My mother called her sensitive. My father called her cultured. I was the practical one, the stubborn one, the one who could handle it. When I told my parents I was joining the army as a combat medic, my father didn't look proud. He looked disappointed. Why not medical school? Colonel Harrison Vance asked me over dinner. If you're going to treat wounds, at least do it with a real title. Combat medic wasn't glamorous enough for him. It didn't come with cocktail conversations or charity galas. It came with dirt, sweat, and decisions you make in under 30 seconds. Cassidy reached across the table that night and squeezed his hand. I think it's brave, she said gently, like she was defending a stray dog. My father nodded once. Brave is fine. Just don't expect applause for patching people up. That was the first time he called me just a medic. He said it again the day I deployed. By the time I got to my unit, no one cared what my father thought. In a blast zone, rank matters. Skill matters. Speed matters. Your ability to stop bleeding matters. Nobody asks who your sister is. I learned to identify tension pneumothorax by sound. I learned how to clamp an artery in low light. I learned that a 19-year-old can look 12 when he's scared enough. I also learned something else. If you don't process what you see, it doesn't disappear. It waits. During downtime, I started sketching, not because I thought I was an artist, because I needed to document faces before they blurred together. I drew on anything I could find. Empty IV packaging, flattened MRE boxes, the backs of supply forms. I drew hands gripping stretchers. I drew boots sticking out from under debris. I drew the look in someone's eyes when they realize you're lying about them being fine. Those sketches weren't dramatic. They were accurate. When my tour ended and I was honorably discharged, I came home with two things, a diagnosis of PTSD and a duffel bag full of drawings. The diagnosis came after 3 panic episodes in a grocery store when a pallet dropped in the next aisle. Loud noise, sudden movement. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. The VA psychiatrist didn't sugarcoat it. You're functioning, he said, but you're carrying more than you think. I didn't argue. Coming home wasn't cinematic. No band, no tears, just my mother rearranging the living room so my father's plaques were more visible. Cassidy had converted the spare bedroom into an art studio while I was gone. White walls, natural light. Framed charcoal studies pinned carefully in a grid. My mother gave me a tight hug in the kitchen and said Cassidy's talent has really blossomed. Of course it had. I stood in that kitchen in my civilian clothes feeling slightly misplaced. My father looked me up and down. So he said, "What's next?" "Or are you planning to live off veteran benefits?" I told him I was looking into school. Maybe law. Maybe something in military advocacy. I wasn't sure yet. He didn't ask about Fallujah. He didn't ask about the people I treated. He asked if I had a plan that sounded impressive enough at his country club. Cassidy floated in with paint on her wrist and kissed his cheek. "I've been experimenting with emotional realism," she said. "It's about capturing unseen trauma." I almost smiled at that. Unseen trauma. She had no idea what that phrase meant outside a studio. Later that night, I unzipped my duffel bag in my childhood bedroom. I laid the sketches out across the bed. There were dozens of them, some detailed, some rushed, all real. I didn't show them to anyone at first. They felt personal, not because they were artistic, because they were evidence of moments I survived. My mother found them a week later while looking for spare sheets. "Oh my God," she said softly. "These are powerful." She called Cassidy in immediately. Cassidy sat on the edge of my bed and studied them carefully. Not dismissive, not impressed, calculating. "These are raw," she said. "There's something here," I shrugged. "They're just notes." My father walked in behind them. He scanned the bed once and frowned. "You're still stuck over there," he said. "This is exactly what I was worried about. I expected that." What I didn't expect was what came next. 2 nights later during dinner, my mother cleared her throat. "We've been thinking," she said carefully. "Cassidy could really benefit from structure. You've always been organized, disciplined. Maybe you could help manage her schedule, help her refine these themes." I blinked. Manage her schedule? "It would give you something to focus on," my father added. "And Cassidy needs someone grounded. You understand trauma. She translates it. "So you want me to run logistics for her art career?" I asked. My mother reached for my hand. "It's temporary, until you figure out your own direction." My own direction. I had just come back from a war zone. Cassidy tilted her head sympathetically. "You could help me contextualize some of these battlefield emotions. It would make the work authentic." Authentic. I looked around that kitchen, the polished countertops, the framed awards on the wall, the normalcy of it all. They weren't asking, they were assigning. I felt the unfairness clearly, but it wasn't explosive. It was quiet and steady. I had carried soldiers twice my size through debris. I had made life or death calls under fire. And now I was being positioned as an assistant to someone who had never left the county. I said yes, not because I agreed, because I wanted to see how far this would go. That night, I packed the sketches back into the duffel bag. Every single one. I didn't know then how valuable they would become. I just knew they were mine. I should have trusted my instincts the night the storm rolled in. Thunder has a way of finding you when your nervous system is already wired too tight. That evening, the sky cracked open over our neighborhood, and the first blast of thunder hit close enough to shake the windows. My body reacted before my mind could reason with it. I was in the garage reorganizing supply boxes like I used to in the field. I liked order. Order made things manageable. The second thunderclap sounded like incoming mortar. My chest tightened instantly. My vision narrowed. I knew I was standing in Virginia, not Fallujah. I knew that logically. My body didn't care. By the time my mother found me, I was on the floor, breathing too fast, hands pressed over my ears like that would block out the sky. The VA psychiatrist had warned me about trigger stacking, lack of sleep, stress, loud noise. Add them together and your brain decides it's back in a combat zone. An ambulance took me to the military hospital for evaluation, protocol, observation, stabilization. Before I left, I dragged the duffel bag of sketches out from under my bed. Cassidy stood in the hallway watching the paramedics strap me in. Her expression was soft, almost concerned. "Can you hold on to these?" I asked her, gripping the bag strap harder than I meant to. "Just until I'm back." She nodded immediately. "Of course. I'll keep them safe." Safe. That word should have meant something. I was admitted for extended inpatient treatment, 30 days minimum, structured therapy, medication adjustment, group sessions with other veterans who understood the difference between fireworks and artillery, without explanation. The hospital was clean and efficient. The doctors were competent. No drama, just routine. In group therapy, a Marine said something that stuck with me. "Trauma doesn't steal your memories," he said. "It steals your control over when they show up." That felt accurate. I focused on stabilizing, breathing exercises, exposure work, controlled recall instead of ambush flashbacks. I did the work because I don't have to do anything. When I was discharged, I felt steady, not cured, functional. I came home on a clear afternoon. The house looked the same, the driveway was clean, the kitchen smelled like lemon cleaner. Cassidy met me in the hallway. She didn't hug me. She held her hands together tightly and looked down. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. I felt it immediately. Not panic, just recognition. "What happened?" "There was a small electrical fire in the spare room," she said quickly. "It started near the outlet. We caught it fast, but..." She swallowed. "Your bag was in there." I didn't interrupt. "It's gone, Sarah. I'm so sorry. The drawings, they were destroyed." Destroyed. I walked past her without speaking and headed straight to the spare room. The walls had been repainted. Fresh drywall patch near one outlet. No lingering smoke smell. Insurance handled most of it. My mother called from the kitchen, like we were discussing a broken appliance. I stepped into the center of the room and looked around carefully. No scorch marks on the ceiling. No visible fire damage beyond a small section of wall that had clearly been replaced. "How bad was it?" I asked calmly. "Contained quickly," my father answered. "Minor incident, but paper burns fast. Paper burns fast, that's true. But paper also leaves ash, smoke damage, residue." I crouched down near the outlet and ran my fingers lightly along the baseboard. Clean. Too clean. Cassidy hovered behind me. "I tried to salvage what I could," she said softly, "but it was all charred." I stood up slowly and faced her. "Did you see them burn?" She hesitated for half a second. Yes. That half second told me more than the word did. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse. I just nodded once. "Okay." That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I replayed the room in my mind. The drywall patch. The lack of smoke odor. The precision of the repair. If there had been a real fire, the rest of the house would have shown it. Even minor electrical fires leave evidence. What I felt wasn't grief. It was assessment. 30 days later, Cassidy announced her first solo exhibition, Emerging Voice, The Reality of War. The invitation read, I stood in the gallery opening night wearing a simple black dress and neutral expression. The room was full, local press, influencers, a few minor political staffers. Cassidy moved through the crowd with practiced grace. The first painting stopped me cold. It was mine. Not exactly as I had drawn it. Oil layered over graphite, color added, shadows deepened. But the structure, the anatomy, the posture, the positioning of hands was identical. A medic kneeling over a wounded soldier, my hands. Except in her version, the medic's face was obscured completely, anonymous, secondary. The soldier's face, however, was rendered with dramatic emphasis. I moved to the next piece, boots sticking out from rubble, mine. Third piece, a young private's half-open eyes. The same angle I had captured on that flattened morphine box, mine. Every single composition traced back to my sketches. She hadn't imagined these scenes, she had translated them directly. A reporter approached me while I stood there. Are you related to the artist, he asked? Yes, I said. She has incredible insight into combat realism. He continued. Almost documentary. Documentary, that's one word for it, I replied. Cassidy stepped up beside us. My sister was in the army, she said brightly. I learned a lot from her stories. Stories. I turned toward her slowly. You never asked for stories, I said evenly. She met my gaze without flinching. I absorb what's around me. Absorb. The crowd moved around us. Cameras flashed. Someone clinked a champagne glass to get attention for a brief speech. Cassidy took the microphone. These works, she said confidently, are my tribute to the unseen wounds of service members. I've studied trauma for years. Studied. I looked at the brushstrokes up close. The oil paint had been applied thick enough to mask the original graphite texture, but not erase it entirely. Under certain lighting, I could still see my original line work pushing through. She hadn't destroyed my drawings. She had repurposed them. The small fire, the missing bag, the clean baseboards. It wasn't an accident. It was removal, calculated and quiet. Applause filled the room. Cassidy smiled like she had built something extraordinary from nothing. And I stood there realizing she had just launched a career on work she never bled for. That was the night I understood something clearly. She didn't steal paper, she stole authorship. I didn't confront her at the gallery, I waited. I went home, changed out of the black dress, and sat at the edge of my bed staring at the wall for a long time, not spiraling, not panicking, just aligning facts. There had been no fire. There had been no accident. There had been theft. The next Sunday, my mother hosted her usual family dinner. Roast chicken, polished silverware, the same framed photo of my father shaking hands with a senator hung above the dining table like a permanent witness. Cassidy arrived late on purpose. She liked attention to adjust around her. She walked in with a small crowd effect, even though there were only 4 of us in the room. "Sorry," she said, smiling lightly. Interview ran long. Of course it did. We sat down, plates were passed, small talk started. My father asked Cassidy about upcoming exhibits. My mother asked about potential sponsors. No one asked me anything. I waited until dessert. "I went to the gallery," I said calmly. Cassidy didn't look surprised. "I figured you might. They're my drawings." Silence. Not shock, not confusion. Silence. My father set his fork down slowly. "Excuse me, the compositions," I continued evenly. "They're based on sketches I made overseas. The structure is identical." Cassidy gave a soft exhale, like she had prepared for this. "Sarah," she said gently, "you were heavily medicated for months." That was her opening move. My mother shifted uncomfortably. "Sweetheart, we talked about this." "The fire?" "There was no real fire," I cut in. "The drywall patch was isolated. No smoke damage. No structural report filed. I checked county records." My father's jaw tightened. "Are you investigating your own family now?" he asked sharply. "I'm stating facts." Cassidy leaned forward, slightly lowering her voice. "You shared those experiences with me. Maybe you don't remember. You were in a fragile state. Fragile. You never asked me for details," I said. "You never once asked about Fallujah." She gave me a sad smile. "Trauma alters memory, Sarah. You of all people should know that." There it was, the pivot. My father's hand hit the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. "Enough." He stood up. "You are accusing your sister of fraud because you can't handle the fact that she succeeded. I'm accusing her because the work is mine." He pointed at me like I was a junior officer who had stepped out of line. "Do you hear yourself? You come back from overseas unstable, you can't keep a job for 6 months, and now you think you're the hidden genius behind her career." I kept my voice steady. "I never said I was a genius." He leaned closer. "You're jealous." "I'm not. You're jealous of your sister's talent to the point of delusion," he snapped. "Cassidy has skill, refinement, vision. You have field stories and a prescription." My mother flinched slightly at that, but she didn't interrupt. "Dad," I said evenly, "this isn't about talent. It's about ownership." He shook his head with visible disgust. "You patched up soldiers. That's admirable. But don't confuse proximity to war with artistic authority." Proximity to war. Cassidy looked down at her plate like this was painful for her. My father's voice hardened. "You were a medic, not a strategist, not a decorated commander. A medic. You treated wounds. That's it. I let him finish. Then I asked one question. Did you see the original sketches before the fire?" He didn't answer. My mother stood up and walked into the kitchen. For a moment, I thought maybe she needed space. She came back holding a check. She placed it in front of me. $2,000. I looked at it, then at her. "Take it," she said quietly. "Use it to get settled somewhere else. Maybe start fresh. Start fresh." She swallowed. "Your accusations are damaging. Cassidy is building something important. Sponsors talk. Donors talk. This kind of instability, I repeated. My father didn't sit back down. "You will not sabotage your sister's future because you can't accept your own limitations," he said firmly. Limitations. I stared at the check again. $2,000. That was the price of silence. "Are you asking me to leave?" I asked. My mother's eyes filled slightly, but her voice stayed controlled. "I'm asking you not to bring this chaos into our home." Our home. Cassidy finally looked up at me directly. "I never meant to hurt you," she said softly. That was almost impressive. "You meant to benefit," I replied. My father pointed toward the hallway. "If you can't support your sister, you don't belong here." There it was. Not discussion, expulsion. I picked up the check, folded it once, and slid it into my jacket pocket. Not because I accepted their version, because I needed seed money. I stood up. "I'm not unstable," I said calmly. "And I'm not confused. I know exactly what I drew. I know exactly when I drew it. And I know what a lie looks like." My father's expression didn't change. "You need help," he said flatly. I nodded once. "I'll get it." I walked down the hallway to my bedroom for what would be the last time. I didn't take much. A suitcase, a few clothes, my discharge paperwork, my service records. The duffel bag of sketches was gone, but the memory of every line was not. Rain started as I stepped outside. Of course it did. The driveway lights reflected off wet pavement. The house looked perfectly composed from the outside, clean, respectable, untouched by conflict. I stood there for a moment under the rain, not crying, not shaking, just aware. Inside that house, I had been reclassified. Not daughter, not veteran, not witness, threat. I got into my car and closed the door. No dramatic music, no screaming, no final speech, just the sound of rain against the windshield and the quiet understanding that I had officially been written out of my own family narrative. I started the engine. They thought they had removed the problem. What they actually did was remove the leash. I didn't drive far that night, just far enough to stop being someone's problem. I rented a small basement apartment in Arlington with the $2,000 my mother handed me like a parting gift. I added my VIA disability compensation and stretched every dollar like it had a pulse. I wasn't thinking about revenge yet. I was thinking about leverage. If I had walked into a courtroom back then and accused Cassidy of theft, I would have lost. No registration filings, no public record, no witnesses willing to testify against her. My father would have backed her with rank reputation and connections. I had sketches in my memory and nothing on paper. That's not evidence. That's emotion. So I enrolled in law school. Not because it sounded impressive to my father, because I needed to understand how the system actually works. I focused on military law, federal contracts, and intellectual property. I already knew the culture of the military. I needed to master the language of liability. During my first semester, I learned something simple. Ownership isn't about who cries louder. It's about who documents first. I didn't document first. That was my mistake. I wasn't going to make it twice. I applied for the JAG Corps after graduation. The interview panel didn't care that I had once been just a medic. They cared that I understood both battlefield operations and statutory interpretation. I passed. For the first time in years, my title matched my capability. Captain Serafina Vance. I wore the uniform again, but this time I carried case files instead of trauma shears. I handled wrongful discharge cases, benefits disputes, contract irregularities, fraud investigations. I learned how federal procurement really operates, how vendors are vetted, how certifications are verified, how one inconsistency can unravel $1 million agreement. At night, I reviewed intellectual property law like it was a second deployment. Copyright duration, derivative works, burden of proof, statute of limitations. People assume revenge is emotional. It's administrative. 3 years into my legal career, I made a decision. I filed a legal name change. Not because I was ashamed of being a Vance, because I wanted distance. The last name I chose belonged to someone who never made it home from Fallujah. Sergeant Daniel Mercer, the same 19-year-old private from that sketch. He died on the evacuation helicopter before we cleared the perimeter. Mercer had no siblings, no legacy foundation, just a folded flag. I took his last name legally and quietly, Serafina Mercer. It wasn't dramatic, just paperwork filed in a county office, but it gave me freedom. My father never called to ask why. Cassidy never noticed. Over time, I transitioned into private practice, federal contracting, and veteran advocacy. There's a niche market where those two overlap. Contractors misrepresent qualifications. Service members get cut out of royalties. Artists lose ownership when they don't understand paperwork. I understood paperwork now. I built a firm from scratch. Small at first, then growing. Mercer and Associates. Later, when the firm expanded and merged with a senior partner, the name evolved again. Vance and Associates. Yes, that Vance. I bought the naming rights strategically through a corporate acquisition. My father saw the name appear in legal directories and assumed a distant cousin had launched it. He never checked shareholder records. That part still makes me smile. People ask me sometimes why I stayed silent for 10 years. They assume fear. It wasn't fear, it was timing. I knew something Cassidy didn't. She couldn't create original battlefield work. She had my archive once, a finite supply. Once she exhausted those compositions, she would have 2 options: repeat herself or fabricate new material. Either choice would expose her. Art built on theft has a shelf life. She needed authenticity to survive in that niche. She didn't have it. She had adaptation skills, surface-level talent, but not source material, so I waited. While she climbed, while critics praised her immersive realism, while sponsors invested, while her brand expanded into therapeutic installations for military spaces. Every year she rose higher, the eventual fall became more catastrophic. Because federal contracts are different from gallery shows. When private collectors get fooled, they feel embarrassed. When the Department of Defense gets defrauded, people go to prison. That's the difference. I never confronted her again after that dinner. Not publicly, not privately. I monitored. I archived every public exhibition catalog. I collected high-resolution prints of her paintings. I analyzed brush layering, underpainting patterns, structural repetition. She thought she was evolving. She was recycling. The human body doesn't change shape just because you add oil paint. Bone alignment remains consistent. Hand positioning in trauma scenes reflects actual procedural technique. And she never knew procedural technique. Only someone who has performed a field arterial clamp knows how the wrist angles naturally under pressure. Only someone who has stabilized a sucking chest wound understands how fabric shifts around the ribcage. She copied those details because they were in my sketches. She didn't understand them. That was her flaw. A thief often forgets one critical fact. The author knows every scratch in the original. I knew which line I hesitated on because my hand was shaking. I knew which shading pattern came from drawing in low light. I knew which figure's shoulders sloped unnaturally because I had limited space on a supply box. Those imperfections were signatures. She painted over them, but she never erased them, and I never forgot them. When her agent announced the upcoming federal contract proposal for therapeutic installations on new military bases, I recognized the opportunity immediately. Federal procurement requires legal validation. Validation requires representation. Representation requires trust. She trusted branding more than due diligence. And that was the opening I had been building toward for a decade. I didn't stay silent because I was weak. I stayed silent because I was preparing. When someone builds a career on stolen foundations, you don't knock on the door while the structure is half finished. You wait until it's fully occupied. Then you check the load-bearing walls. I approved the outreach email before my assistant hit send. By then, Cassidy's career wasn't climbing anymore. It was plateauing, and in her world, that's the same thing as falling. For the past 2 years, her exhibitions had started to look familiar. Critics used phrases like revisiting themes and stylistic consistency. That's art world code for running out of ideas. Private collectors noticed repetition. Sponsors slowed down. One corporate donor quietly withdrew funding after an internal audit flagged creative redundancy. Redundancy. That was generous. She had already used every original sketch I brought home from Fallujah. Every composition, every face, every field posture. Without my archive, she had nothing new to pull from. That's when she pivoted. Instead of chasing galleries, she chased government contracts. Therapeutic art installations for newly constructed military facilities. It sounded patriotic, clinical, necessary. It also came with federal oversight. The Department of Defense issued a request for proposals for curated visual therapy environments in 3 new bases. Estimated value $5 million over 3 years. Cassidy submitted a proposal under her studio's name. She attached a catalog that looked familiar to me. Some reworked older pieces. A few newly expanded canvases based on my original field sketches. And one particularly ambitious piece, a large-scale reinterpretation of that 19-year-old private. She needed legal certification to move forward. Federal procurement requires documentation, copyright ownership, originality affirmations, indemnification clauses. No agency signs off without legal review. That's where I came in, not directly. I had one of our firm's external consultants reach out to her agent. Neutral tone, high praise, strong interest in representing her for federal compliance review. Cassidy's agent responded within 24 hours. Desperation speeds up communication. We scheduled a formal presentation at our DC office. My name did not appear anywhere in the correspondence. The managing partner handled all visible communication. Cassidy never asked who owned the firm. She saw Vance and Associates and assumed proximity to power. She never looked up corporate filings. When she walked into that conference room with her leather portfolio, she wasn't just signing paperwork. She was stepping into jurisdiction. During the preliminary review, we requested high-resolution originals for authentication. Standard procedure. She hesitated briefly. I'll need those returned promptly, she said. Of course, Daniel assured her. Chain of custody documentation will be provided. Chain of custody. She didn't realize that phrase applied to evidence too. 2 days later, her studio delivered 6 large canvases and 3 detailed preliminary studies. They were placed in our secure review room. I waited until the building cleared out for the evening. Then I walked in alone. The first painting I examined was the expanded Last Breath piece. Oil paint ages in a particular way. Even in controlled studio environments, certain pigments oxidize subtly. Surface cracking patterns tell a timeline. I leaned in close. The underlayer was older than the top coat. That wasn't surprising. What interested me was where the oil had thinned. In 2 sections around the upper rib cage and along the medic's wrist, the paint was applied more lightly, almost translucent. She had rushed those areas. I turned off the overhead lights and switched on a focused inspection lamp. Still nothing visible to the naked eye. Good. That meant she had never tested for it. When I originally drew those sketches 10 years ago, I did something small and instinctive. Combat medics label everything. Supplies, IV bags, field notes. I labeled my drawings too. Using medical-grade luminescent ink I had taken from a supply kit. It's the same type used to mark equipment in low-visibility conditions. Invisible under normal light. Reactive under UV. At the time, it wasn't strategic. It was habit. Now it was leverage. I ran my finger lightly over the canvas surface. I could feel the texture shift where graphite once sat directly on cardboard. She had mounted the originals onto stretched canvas before painting over them. That explained the slightly uneven tension across certain frames. She hadn't destroyed my sketches. She had preserved them. That mistake would cost her. I moved to the second piece. A wounded soldier being dragged behind partial cover. The shoulder alignment was exact. Too exact. Anatomical stress angles don't replicate perfectly by memory alone. She had traced. Maybe freehand, maybe projected. But the skeletal structure underneath was mine. I smiled. Not out of anger, out of confirmation. She thought oil paint erased authorship. It doesn't, it just adds a layer. I finished reviewing all 9 pieces and documented everything internally. Photographic records, surface analysis, chain of custody logs. Then I sent a brief internal memo to my litigation team. Prepare contingency file. Potential federal fraud exposure pending authentication review. That's all it said. The next morning, Cassidy returned to the office to finalize contract representation. She looked energized. I'm so relieved to have a firm of this caliber backing me, she said brightly. Of this caliber. Daniel nodded. We take compliance seriously. She signed the engagement agreement without requesting ownership disclosure, no due diligence, no background search. $5 million can blur curiosity. Before leaving, she asked one question. You don't foresee any issues with originality claims, do you? Daniel smiled politely. That depends entirely on documentation. She laughed lightly. Everything is authentic. Authentic. After she left, I returned to the review room one more time. I turned off the lights completely and stood in the dark for a moment. Then I switched on the portable UV inspection lamp. Across the surface of the central canvas, faint lines began to glow. Unit designation, date. Property of Sergeant Serafina Vance, 1st Medic Division. Right beneath the painted ribcage. Still intact, still undeniable. The oil layer hadn't blocked it fully, it had only concealed it from people who never thought to look. I switched the light off. She believed she was securing financial salvation. She didn't realize she had just delivered physical evidence directly into my custody. $5 million wasn't the trap. Federal verification was. And she had walked into it voluntarily. I scheduled the honorary signing ceremony for a Friday afternoon. Cassidy loves an audience. I made sure she had one. The invitations were formal. Department of Defense procurement officers, 2 base commanders, a representative from the Army Medical Corps. My managing partner signed the email. I added 3 personal invitations. Colonel Harrison Vance, retired. Eleanor Vance, Cassidy Vance. The subject line read, Celebration of Federal Arts Partnership. My father responded within an hour, proud to attend. Of course he was. On the day of the event, the lobby of Vance & Associates looked exactly how it was designed to look. Controlled, expensive, credible, neutral marble, framed certifications, clean lines, no clutter. Cassidy arrived first dressed in navy this time, patriotic without being obvious. You really didn't have to make this such a production, she said lightly to Daniel. He smiled. Federal partnerships deserve formality. My parents arrived 5 minutes later. My father wore his old posture like it was still part of his uniform. My mother scanned the room quietly, taking in the firm's name etched into the wall again. Still no questions. I stepped out from the interior hallway once everyone was inside. For a brief second, none of them recognized me. Then Cassidy blinked. Sarah, I held her gaze evenly. Good afternoon. My father stiffened immediately. What are you doing here? I own the building, I said. Silence spread fast. Daniel stepped forward smoothly. Colonel Vance, Mrs. Vance, welcome. Captain. He corrected himself with a slight nod toward me. Attorney Mercer is the founding partner of this firm. My father looked from Daniel to me, then up at the name on the wall. Vance and Associates. You're Mercer, he said. Slowly. I replied. I reacquired the Vance name through corporate merger last year. Cassidy's expression shifted from confusion to calculation in under 3 seconds. This is some kind of joke, she said quietly. No, I answered. It's compliance. The procurement officers approached, hands extended. We appreciate your firm's diligence in reviewing Ms. Vance's submission, one of them said. I take authenticity seriously, I replied. Cassidy recovered quickly. She always does in public. Well, she said with a tight smile, I'm glad we're keeping this in the family. Family, I gestured toward the interior hallway. Before final signatures, I'd like to show everyone a private exhibition room. The officers nodded. My father followed stiffly. My mother avoided eye contact. The exhibition room was dimly lit by design. 9 canvases stood evenly spaced along the walls. Cassidy's federal submission pieces, mounted professionally, cataloged, spotlit. She looked pleased at first. This is beautiful, she said. I stepped to the center of the room. Art is extraordinary, I began calmly. It captures what words fail to communicate. The Army Medical Corps representative nodded. I walked toward the largest canvas, the wounded soldier with exposed ribcage tension. For example, I continued, this piece demonstrates remarkable anatomical precision. Cassidy smiled faintly. I pointed to the chest area. Notice the compression angle at the upper sternum, the way the wrist rotates inward. That specific positioning replicates an emergency arterial clamp technique used in battlefield trauma cases. One of the officers leaned closer. That's a very specific observation, he said. It is, I agreed. Because that technique isn't publicly taught outside military medical training. Cassidy's smile tightened. I turned to face her directly. How did you learn to render that detail so accurately? She held her ground. Research, interviews. Which manual, I asked. She hesitated. The Army Medical Corps representative spoke up. Field arterial clamps aren't detailed in public literature. They're procedural, not academic. I nodded. Exactly. I walked to the second canvas, the soldier being dragged behind cover. Here, the shoulder dislocation angle reflects realistic weight distribution during extraction under fire, not theoretical. Observed. My father's jaw clenched. What are you implying, he demanded. I'm not implying anything, I said calmly. I'm asking a simple question. I faced Cassidy again. You've never deployed, I said. You've never completed combat medic training. You've never been certified in battlefield trauma response. So how did you reproduce these anatomical realities with this level of precision? She swallowed once. It's artistic interpretation, she said. I nodded slightly. Interpretation doesn't usually include correct subclavian artery placement. The room went very quiet. I stepped back toward the light controls. There's something else, I said evenly. I turned off the overhead lights. The room dropped into darkness except for the faint ambient glow from the hallway. Cassidy shifted slightly. What are you doing? She asked. I switched on the handheld UV inspection lamp and aimed it at the center of the primary canvas. Lines began to glow, soft at first, then unmistakable. Under the rib cage, just beneath the oil paint text, appeared in pale luminescent green. Property of Sergeant Serafina Vance, 1st Medic Division, date, unit number. The procurement officers stepped closer instinctively. I moved the UV light across the surface. Additional markings appeared near the lower quadrant. A service member's identification number. I spoke clearly. When I was deployed, I labeled every field sketch with medical-grade luminescent ink. It's standard in supply marking. Invisible under normal light, reactive under ultraviolet. I moved to the second canvas, more text illuminated. Different soldier ID, different date, same signature line. Cassidy's breathing changed. Faster now. That's not possible, she said. It is, I replied calmly, because these canvases were mounted over my original graphite sketches. The oil paint didn't block the UV spectrum completely. I looked at the Army Medical Corps representative. Would you like to verify those service numbers? He stepped forward immediately. Yes. My father took a step back. What is this? He demanded. This, I said evenly, is authorship. I moved the UV light across all 9 canvases. Every single one revealed markings. Dates spanning my deployment timeline, my name, my unit. Cassidy's composure cracked visibly. You're setting me up, she whispered. No, I answered. You set yourself up when you submitted federally contracted work built on material you didn't create. The procurement officer turned to Daniel. We'll need to suspend final signature pending investigation. That would be appropriate, Daniel replied. I turned off the UV lamp. The room returned to dim neutrality. My father looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. You planned this, he said. Yes, I replied. Because combat medics are trained to identify hidden damage, and I had just illuminated it. I didn't turn the lights back on right away. I kept the UV lamp moving slowly across the walls. Every canvas responded the same way. Under oil paint beneath years of public praise, the same words surfaced again and again. Property of Sergeant Serafina Vance, 1st Medic Division, unit numbers, dates, field annotations. Not dramatic, not poetic, precise. The procurement officers exchanged a look that didn't need translation. One of them pulled out his phone immediately. We're suspending contract execution, he said firmly. This triggers mandatory federal review. Cassidy stepped backward like the air had shifted against her. This is a misunderstanding, she said quickly. I collaborated. We discussed concepts. She's trying to claim inspiration as ownership. Inspiration doesn't leave service numbers embedded in substrate, I replied. Her hands began to shake. My father finally found his voice. This is absurd, he barked. You're ambushing your own sister in front of federal officials. I turned to face him evenly. She ambushed me 10 years ago. The Army Medical Corps representative was still examining the glowing text with visible focus. These numbers correspond to active duty personnel from the Fallujah rotation, he said. We can verify that within minutes. That won't be necessary, I replied calmly. I already submitted certified copies of my deployment records and time-stamped field logs to the firm's internal compliance department. Cassidy stared at me. You've been planning this, she whispered. Yes, I said. The procurement officer's tone shifted from diplomatic to procedural. Ms. Vance, we're required to notify Federal Investigative Services when potential fraud is identified in a procurement process. This isn't fraud, she snapped. This is a family dispute. It became federal the moment you signed preliminary compliance documents affirming sole authorship, he replied. Her breathing grew shallow. My mother moved toward her instinctively. There must be a way to resolve this quietly. There isn't. Before anyone could argue further, 2 uniformed military police officers entered the hallway outside the exhibition room. They had been stationed downstairs once compliance flagged the anomaly earlier that morning. Standard precaution when federal assets are involved. Cassidy's eyes widened. You called them, she asked me. I called compliance, I corrected. The senior MP stepped inside calmly. Ms. Cassidy Vance, he asked. She didn't answer at first. Yes, she said finally. You are being advised that this matter is under investigation for potential violations of federal procurement law and misrepresentation of intellectual property associated with active duty service member documentation. Her knees buckled. Not theatrically, just structurally. She sank into the nearest chair, staring at the floor. My father took a step forward. This is outrageous, he said sharply. Do you have any idea who I am? The MP didn't react. Yes, sir, he said professionally. Retired Colonel Harrison Vance. That landed harder than any insult could have. Rank recognition without deference. My father looked at me like I had detonated something inside his house. You would destroy your own family for this, he demanded. I removed my glasses slowly and met his eyes directly. You once said I was just a medic, I said calmly, that I patched wounds and that was the limit of my relevance. His jaw tightened. Combat medics are trained to identify damage quickly, I continued. Internal bleeding, compromised structures, hidden fractures. I let that settle for a second. We're also trained to recognize infection before it spreads. Cassidy looked up at me, eyes red but dry. You could have talked to me, she said. I did, I replied. At dinner, you said I was unstable. Silence again. The MPS requested that Cassidy step into the adjacent conference room for formal questioning. She stood unsteadily but complied. No handcuffs, no spectacle, just process. My mother reached for her arm. Cassidy, don't say anything until we get a lawyer, she whispered. Cassidy looked at me one more time. There was no apology in her expression, only shock that the floor had finally given out. The door closed behind them. The procurement officer turned toward me. We'll need full documentation for the record, he said. You'll have it, I answered. My father stayed in the exhibition room with me. For the first time in my life, he looked unsure. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. No, I replied. I corrected one. He glanced at the canvases again, now dark and neutral without the UV light. I thought you were spiraling back then, he admitted. The accusations, the paranoia. I wasn't paranoid, I said. I was accurate. He didn't argue. My mother stepped out of the conference room, face pale. They're talking about charges, she said to him. Federal charges. He closed his eyes briefly. For years, he measured worth in rank, reputation, and optics. Now his family name was attached to a procurement fraud investigation. He looked at me again. You could withdraw, he said. Say this was a misunderstanding. Protect the name. The name. I held his gaze. You protected her reputation when she stole from me, I said evenly. You asked me to leave so she could build hers. He had no response. The procurement officer approached us one last time. Thank you for your cooperation, he said to me. This evidence is substantial. Substantial, that's the word you use when something is undeniable. As the officers escorted Cassidy out through a side exit to avoid press, my father stood motionless. This wasn't a public spectacle. It was administrative collapse. Her empire didn't explode. It dissolved under documentation. I turned the overhead lights back on fully. The canvases looked ordinary again. Paint, frame, wall. But underneath the truth remained permanently embedded. My father finally spoke, voice lower than I had ever heard it. You waited 10 years, yes, for this. For accountability, he studied me carefully. You're not the same person who left this house in the rain. No, I said. I'm not. Because that night they removed me from their narrative. Today I controlled it. I didn't speak to the press. I let the documents speak. Within 48 hours, the Department of Defense issued a formal suspension notice. The contract was voided pending investigation. A week later, federal prosecutors filed charges related to procurement fraud, false certification, and misrepresentation of intellectual property tied to active duty service records. Cassidy's upcoming exhibitions were canceled almost immediately. Sponsors withdrew support in statements that sounded carefully neutral. In light of recent developments, out of respect for the integrity of our partners, pending legal clarity, translation were out. Her social media accounts went dark. The art world moves fast when credibility collapses. Galleries that once called her visionary now described her work as under review. Critics who praised her realism quietly edited online articles. Overnight success reverses quickly when documentation surfaces. Cassidy retained legal counsel, of course, a high-priced firm, aggressive, strategic. But federal cases aren't emotional arguments. They're evidence chains. The UV markings, deployment records, canvas substrate analysis, chain of custody documentation from my firm. Facts are patient. My parents came to my office 2 weeks after the charges were announced. Not as guests this time, as petitioners. My father looked older. Not physically frail, just diminished. We need to talk, he said. We are, I replied, gesturing toward the conference chairs. My mother sat first. She clasped her purse tightly in her lap like it might anchor the room. She's facing prison, my mother said quietly. Yes, federal prison, she clarified. I'm aware. My father leaned forward. You've made your point, he said. The contract is gone. Her reputation is destroyed. Withdraw the civil claim. Cooperate with her defense. Protect what's left of this family. Family, I folded my hands calmly. You asked me to leave this family, I said. You handed me $2,000 and told me not to damage her brand. He flinched slightly. That was different, he said. It wasn't. My mother's voice cracked for the first time. She made a mistake. No, I said evenly. She made a strategy. There's a difference. Silence settled between us. You're really going to let this go all the way, my father asked. I'm not letting it do anything, I replied. The system is doing what it's designed to do. He tried one last angle. Our name will never recover from this. I looked at him steadily. Your name survived war, I said. It'll survive accountability. They left without shaking my hand. Cassidy eventually accepted a plea agreement, reduced sentence in exchange for full admission of misrepresentation and restitution agreement. She avoided a lengthy trial, but not a record. Her titles were revoked, awards rescinded, professional memberships terminated. She wasn't the only one forced to adjust. I filed a civil action for intellectual property theft and unjust enrichment. Not because I needed the money, because precedent matters. The settlement came months later, confidential figure, substantial, every dollar documented. I didn't use it to expand the firm. I used it to establish the Mercer Foundation for Veteran Artists, grant programs, legal workshops, copyright education for service members who create during deployment, pro bono contract review for veterans entering commercial art agreements. The first seminar I hosted had 12 attendees. 3 of them admitted they had no idea how to protect their work legally. That's how theft happens. Not always with malice, often with ignorance. I made sure they left informed. A year after the investigation concluded, I drove to Arlington National Cemetery, early on a clear morning. Section 60, I know the row without checking. Sergeant Daniel Mercer, 19 years old, killed in action. I stood in front of his headstone, holding a single white rose. I don't come for drama, I come for alignment. I kept my word, I said quietly. No audience, no cameras, just quiet air and rows of names that never got to argue at dinner tables. I placed the rose at the base of the stone. For years, I carried anger like extra gear. Now I carry clarity. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Unknown DC number, I answered. Attorney Mercer, this is the Office of the General Counsel at the Pentagon, the voice said. We'd like to discuss a consultation role regarding veteran intellectual property protections in federal contracting. Of course you would. I'm listening, I replied. The work doesn't stop just because a case closes. Justice isn't loud most of the time. It's structured, it's procedural, it's boring until it matters. Before I left the cemetery, I looked once more at Mercer's name carved in stone. 10 years ago, I drew his face because I didn't want him erased. Today, his name funds legal protection for others like him. That feels proportionate. People ask me sometimes if it was worth it. The silence, the waiting, the fallout. Here's what I tell them. Truth is like a wound on the battlefield. If you cover it with lies instead of cleaning it properly, it doesn't disappear. It festers, it spreads. And eventually it destroys the body from the inside. You can delay accountability. You can rename it. You can paint over it. But infection always reveals itself. So let me ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have exposed her the moment you knew, or would you have waited until the stakes were high enough to matter? And when betrayal comes from inside your own family, do you protect the name, or do you protect the truth? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. And if you believe that accountability matters more than appearances, subscribe. There are more stories about quiet justice than people think. I didn't stay silent for 10 years because I was afraid. I stayed silent because I was outmatched. That's not the same thing. There's a moment after betrayal when you have 2 choices. You can explode immediately and hope noise replaces evidence. Or you can step back, measure the terrain, and admit something uncomfortable: you don't have enough leverage yet. When Cassidy stole my work, I had anger, I had memory, I had certainty. What I didn't have was proof that could survive scrutiny. And in the real world, especially in legal business or institutional environments, certainty doesn't win, documentation does. One of the most dangerous lies people believe is that silence automatically equals weakness. Sometimes it does, but sometimes silence is reconnaissance. If you've ever been gaslit, you know how disorienting it is. Someone reframes your reality with such confidence that you start questioning your own perception. You replay conversations in your head. You ask yourself if you overreacted, if you misunderstood, if maybe you're too sensitive. Gaslighting isn't loud, it's surgical. In my case, PTSD became the weapon. The narrative shifted from, "she stole from you," to "you're unstable." That's strategic character erosion. If someone can discredit your mental stability, they don't have to address your facts. Here's what I learned: when people attack your credibility, instead of your evidence, they're buying time. So you buy your own. Instead of arguing at dinner tables, I started studying systems, contracts, copyright law, federal procurement standards. I didn't need my family to agree with me. I needed institutions to recognize what was true. If you're in a situation right now where someone has wronged you at work and business, even inside your own family, ask yourself 3 questions before you act. Do I have documentation? Do I have position? Do I understand the system I'm about to enter? If the answer to any of those is no, slow down. Emotion feels urgent, strategy feels slow, but urgency without structure is just noise. There's a difference between avoiding conflict and preparing for it. Avoidance looks like pretending nothing happened. Strategy looks like building strength in private. When I went to law school, it wasn't about revenge. It was about fluency. I didn't want to walk into rooms where decisions were made and not understand the language. If someone takes your work, your credit, or your opportunity, you don't just need outrage. You need literacy, legal literacy, financial literacy, procedural literacy. That's not dramatic advice. It's practical. Here's something most people don't realize. The system is not emotional. It doesn't reward who suffered the most. It rewards who documented the most. Save emails, timestamp drafts, register copyrights, get contracts in writing, separate family from business legally, not verbally. Trust is not a legal framework. And here's another uncomfortable truth: speaking too early can weaken your case. If I had publicly accused Cassidy the week after her first exhibition, I would have looked bitter, defensive, reactive. She would have framed it as sibling jealousy, and without federal oversight, it would have stayed a private narrative war. Instead, I waited until the stakes were institutional. Federal contracts don't care about sibling dynamics. They care about compliance. That's when the truth mattered. Waiting is hard. It feels passive. You watch someone benefit from your work. You watch people applaud them. You swallow responses you want to unleash. But every year, I stayed quiet. I wasn't shrinking. I was accumulating skill, position, access, evidence. When the moment came, I didn't need to shout. I needed to turn on a light. If you're dealing with betrayal right now, here's my advice. Don't rush to be heard. Rush to be prepared. There's a reason military training emphasizes patience under fire. Reaction without assessment gets people hurt. Assessment first, action second. Another thing I want to be clear about: silence should not cost you your identity. If staying quiet starts to erode your self-worth, that's not strategy anymore. That's suppression. I didn't deny what happened. I acknowledged it privately. I documented it mentally. I used it as motivation to upgrade my position. There's power in delayed response. Not because revenge tastes better cold, but because truth lands harder when it's backed by structure. A lot of people watching this might be in workplaces where someone took credit for your idea, or families where one sibling is protected while another is dismissed, or partnerships where loyalty is demanded but not reciprocated. You don't fix those dynamics by arguing harder. You fix them by becoming undeniable. Build credentials, build networks, build proof, build alternatives. The goal isn't to destroy someone. The goal is to make your reality unignorable. Silence without growth is stagnation. Silence with preparation is transformation. And here's the final thing I learned: waiting isn't about punishment. It's about alignment. When you act too early, you fight people. When you act at the right time, you engage systems. Systems are slower, but they're cleaner. If you're being underestimated right now, don't waste energy trying to convince people who benefit from misunderstanding you. Upgrade yourself quietly. Let them underestimate you. Just make sure that when the moment comes, you're not bringing emotion to a documentation fight. Because in the end, power built in silence is stronger than anger performed in public. When my parents sat across from me and asked me to protect the family name, I realized something I should have understood years earlier. Loyalty can be manipulated. There's a version of loyalty that's healthy. It looks like support, accountability, and truth-telling even when it's uncomfortable. And then there's the counterfeit version. The counterfeit version demands silence in exchange for belonging. When my father said, "Withdraw the claim. Protect what's left of this family," what he was really saying was this: protect the image, not the truth, not the harm, not the integrity, the image. A lot of families operate this way, especially high-achieving ones. Success becomes the shared currency. The sibling who performs well publicly becomes the investment. The sibling who disrupts the narrative becomes the liability. If you've ever been the inconvenient one in your family, you know what that feels like. You're told you're too intense, too sensitive, too rigid, too unforgiving. But what you really are is unwilling to pretend. Here's the hard truth: blood does not automatically equal moral alignment. Shared DNA does not mean shared values. And loyalty without accountability isn't loyalty. It's enabling. There's a difference between forgiveness and enabling behavior. Forgiveness is personal. It's internal. It frees you from carrying resentment. Enabling is structural. It removes consequences so the behavior continues. If I had withdrawn the civil claim against Cassidy, that wouldn't have been forgiveness. That would have been interference with accountability. People often confuse peace with silence. Peace is built on truth. Silence is built on suppression. When families say, "Let's just move on," what they sometimes mean is, "Let's not examine this too closely." But unexamined damage doesn't disappear. It just embeds itself deeper. I had to learn how to set boundaries without needing approval. That's uncomfortable, especially if you were raised to equate obedience with love. Setting boundaries with family feels like betrayal at first. You're breaking an unspoken contract. But here's what I've learned: access is earned, not inherited. Just because someone is your parent, sibling, or relative doesn't mean they have unlimited access to your life, your silence, or your integrity. Respect is conditional on behavior. If someone repeatedly dismisses your reality, manipulates facts, or demands that you compromise your values to protect theirs, you are not obligated to cooperate. That doesn't mean you have to hate them. It means you have to choose yourself. And choosing yourself will often look selfish to people who benefited from your compliance. My mother said she made a mistake. That statement bothered me more than the accusation years earlier. A mistake is accidental. This was strategic. We need to be precise with language. If you minimize intentional harm as a mistake, you reduce the seriousness of the behavior. You make it easier to repeat. In business, if someone falsifies documents, we don't call it a mistake. We call it fraud. In medicine, if someone deliberately mislabels a dosage, we don't call it a mistake. We call it malpractice. But inside families, harmful patterns get softer language. She didn't mean it. He was stressed. You know how they are. That's how cycles continue. If you're watching this and you're struggling with family pressure right now, here's something practical. Before you respond to a request for loyalty, ask yourself, is this request aligned with my values? Is this request asking me to ignore truth? Is this request asking me to carry someone else's consequences? If the answer is yes, pause. You don't have to react emotionally. You don't have to make a dramatic declaration. You can simply say no. No is not disrespectful. No is not cruel. No is clarity. One of the most powerful skills you can develop as an adult is the ability to tolerate someone else's disappointment. My father was disappointed in me for pursuing accountability. That was uncomfortable. But his disappointment did not outweigh my responsibility to the truth. We often confuse harmony with health. A family can look harmonious from the outside and still operate on denial internally. Real health allows conflict. Real health allows truth. Real health allows consequences. If the only way to stay in a family is to stay silent, you're not in a healthy system. You're in a controlled one. I didn't cut my parents off completely. I didn't stage a dramatic exit from every holiday. I simply redefined the terms. No discussion about withdrawing legal claims. No revision of documented facts. No pretending this was a misunderstanding. Boundaries don't require speeches. They require consistency. If someone crosses a boundary and you immediately soften it to avoid tension, you teach them it wasn't real. Consistency is what makes boundaries credible. Another thing I want to say clearly: protecting your integrity is not an attack on your family. It's a refusal to participate in distortion. There's a difference. You can love someone and still refuse to enable them. You can acknowledge history and still demand accountability. You can share a last name and still stand on opposite sides of truth. If you've spent years trying to be the good one, the easy one, the low-maintenance one, understand this. Peace built on self-erasure isn't peace. It's quiet resentment waiting to surface. And resentment eventually shows up somewhere: health, relationships, career. I chose clarity instead. It cost me comfort. It cost me approval. But it gave me alignment. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If your family asked you to lie subtly or directly to preserve their image, would you? And if you wouldn't, are you strong enough to withstand the disappointment that follows? Because sometimes the most loyal thing you can do for a system is refuse to protect its dysfunction. If you've ever had to set a boundary with someone who shares your blood, I want to hear about it. And if this conversation resonates with you, subscribe. These stories aren't about revenge. They're about structured truth and the cost of pretending everything is fine. When I legally changed my last name to Mercer, people assumed it was about escape. It wasn't. It was about definition. For most of my life, my identity was assigned to me. Daughter of Colonel Harrison Vance. Sister of the gifted artist. The intense one. The unstable one. Just a medic. Labels are convenient. They save people the effort of understanding you. The problem is if you don't challenge them, they start to feel accurate. After I left home that night in the rain, I realized something uncomfortable. If I stayed inside the narrative they built for me, I would spend the rest of my life reacting to it. So I stepped outside it. Changing my last name wasn't dramatic. It was administrative, but psychologically, it mattered. It separated who I was becoming from who they insisted I was. Here's something I want you to understand clearly. Betrayal doesn't just take what you created. It tries to redefine who you are. When someone steals your work and succeeds with it, the theft isn't just material, it's reputational. It shifts perception. People start associating your strengths with someone else's name. That can distort your sense of identity if you let it. For a while, I struggled with that. If my art was credited to her, what did that make me? If my family believed her version, was I the delusional one? If I walked away, was I confirming their narrative? These are the kinds of internal questions no one sees. And this is where identity becomes critical. Identity is not what people call you. It's what you repeatedly choose to do. When I enrolled in law school, I wasn't trying to prove my father wrong. I wasn't trying to outshine Cassidy. I was building a skill set. That distinction matters. If you build your life around proving someone wrong, you're still orbiting them. If you build your life around becoming stronger, you're orbiting your own standards. There's a huge difference. A lot of people watching this may feel underestimated right now. Maybe you're the sibling who wasn't celebrated, the employee whose ideas get repackaged by someone louder, the partner whose contributions are minimized. The instinct is to shout. Resist that. Shouting rarely upgrades your position. Skill does. Competence does. Documentation does. I didn't reclaim my identity by arguing louder at family dinners. I reclaimed it by earning credentials no one could dismiss. Law degree, JAG commission, federal case wins, firm ownership. Each one built a structure around my name that no one else could occupy. Here's something practical if someone is defining you in a way that limits you. Ask yourself what measurable upgrade would make that definition obsolete. Not emotionally obsolete, structurally obsolete. If someone calls you inexperienced, gain certification. If someone calls you unreliable, document performance. If someone calls you unstable, build consistency. You don't erase labels by debating them. You outgrow them. And here's another important truth: people can copy your product. They can't copy your capacity. Cassidy copied my sketches. She copied my compositions. She copied anatomical precision she didn't fully understand. What she couldn't copy was the training that produced those details. She couldn't copy field experience. She couldn't copy muscle memory under pressure. She couldn't copy the way a medic evaluates damage instinctively. That capacity showed up years later in courtrooms and compliance reviews. Your capacity is built over time. Your capacity compounds. Your capacity is portable. No one can steal that. If you're rebuilding after betrayal, focus less on reclaiming what was taken and more on expanding what can't be taken. Skills, network, financial literacy, legal literacy, emotional regulation. When you invest in those, your name becomes secondary to your capability. That's when identity stabilizes. Another thing I learned: you don't need universal validation to be legitimate. For years, my father didn't acknowledge what I built. My mother avoided discussing it. Parts of my extended family treated the situation like an unfortunate misunderstanding. And yet the work continued. Your legitimacy doesn't require family approval. It requires internal alignment. That doesn't mean you don't feel the absence. It means you don't depend on it. If you're waiting for someone who hurt you to validate your growth, you're tying your future to their awareness. Detach from that. Build anyway. There's a quiet confidence that develops when you know you can sustain yourself regardless of who applauds. That confidence isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It's steady. When I stood in front of Mercer's grave and later answered a call from the Pentagon, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt aligned. The work I was doing made sense. The path I chose made sense. The name I carried made sense. And that's the real outcome after betrayal. Not revenge, not public humiliation, not even justice. Alignment. If someone is trying to define you right now in a way that shrinks you, remember this. They can copy your output. They cannot copy your growth. They can question your memory. They cannot erase your training. They can dismiss your early stage. They cannot stop your long-term expansion. So build a name that stands on structure, not approval. Build credentials, build resilience, build consistency, and most importantly, build in a way that even if your work is stolen, your capacity remains unmistakably yours. Let me ask you this. If someone took credit for your work tomorrow, would you still have the skill to do it again? If the answer is yes, you're already ahead. If the answer is no, that's where your focus needs to go. Tell me in the comments what label you're currently trying to outgrow. And if this series helped you rethink silence, loyalty, and identity, subscribe. There's more value in building quietly than most people realize.
Final note. This story is a work of fiction, but the valuable lessons we discuss are entirely real and continue to happen to many people every day. If this style isn't for you, that's perfectly okay. Please feel free to look for other content that better suits your needs.